People remember scandals by their loudest names: Hansie Cronje, Herschelle Gibbs, Henry Williams. But scandals are never built by one man alone. Behind every headline figure, there are quieter names, players who were never banned, never jailed, never fully exposed, yet whose names appeared where they were never supposed to appear. Today's story is about one of those names, Nicky Boje, a respected South African spinner, a World Cup winner, a player whose career seemed clean, professional, and largely controversy-free. And yet, during the most explosive corruption investigation in South African cricket history, his name surfaced, quietly, carefully, and uncomfortably, inside official records. Not as the mastermind, not as the fall guy, but as someone implicated. This is not a story about guilt declared in a courtroom. This is a story about questions that were never fully answered, about evidence that existed but never became punishment, and about how cricket sometimes chooses silence over clarity. This is the story of Nicky Boje and the shadows cast by the King Commission. Nicky Boje came into South African cricket as a dependable left-arm spinner, not a superstar, but a utility player, someone captains trusted to do a job. He played in an era dominated by big personalities and aggressive match winners, which meant Boje rarely occupied the spotlight. That, in many ways, was his greatest protection. He represented South Africa during a time when the team was rebuilding after isolation, desperate to prove its integrity, dominance, and professionalism on the world stage. South African cricket was not just playing matches, it was defending a national reputation. Which is why when match-fixing allegations exploded in the year 2000, the shockwaves were seismic. Hansie Cronje's confession ripped the sport open. Suddenly, private phone calls, bank transfers, bookmaker meetings, and coded conversations were dragged into public view. South African cricket launched a full inquiry, headed by Judge Edwin King, what would become known as the King Commission. The goal was simple: uncover the truth, no matter how uncomfortable. And what emerged was not just one corrupt captain, but a network of interactions, approaches, and names. Among those names was Nicky Boje. The King Commission did not accuse Boje of fixing matches outright. That distinction matters, but it did identify him as being implicated in the inquiry, along with Cronje, Gibbs, and Williams, players whose cases were far more widely publicized. So what does implicated actually mean? It means evidence existed that raised concerns. It means his name appeared in investigative material. It means there were interactions or references that investigators believed warranted scrutiny. According to reporting from the inquiry, Boje's name surfaced in relation to information flows, details about matches that bookmakers sought and players sometimes provided, pitch conditions, team selections, strategic insights, the kind of information that, on its own, might seem harmless, but in the wrong hands becomes currency. One of the most uncomfortable truths about corruption in sport is that it doesn't always begin with deliberate fixing. Often it begins with conversation, a casual call, a friendly intermediary, a question that seems innocent until money appears. The King Commission revealed that Cronje acted as a central hub, but he was not operating in isolation. Investigators examined who he spoke to, who he referenced, and who appeared in related communications. Nicky Boje's name appearing in that context raised alarms. Not because he was proven to throw a match, but because cricket authorities could not ignore the possibility of involvement at some level. Boje, for his part, denied wrongdoing, and crucially, the commission did not find sufficient evidence to charge or ban him. That outcome allowed his career to continue largely uninterrupted. But absence of punishment does not equal absence of suspicion. And that's where this story becomes complicated. Cricket history is filled with players whose careers ended with bans, and players whose names were quietly filed away, never fully explained to fans. The public tends to see corruption as binary, guilty or innocent. The reality is far messier. The King Commission operated under legal and evidentiary constraints. It could not punish without proof that met a specific threshold. In Boje's case, that threshold was never crossed. Yet his inclusion in the inquiry tells us something important. It tells us that corruption had reached a point where investigators were forced to look beyond the obvious culprits. It tells us that the environment within the team had become vulnerable, where lines between professional conduct and unethical behavior were dangerously thin. Boje was part of that environment, and environments matter. When leadership collapses, as it did under Cronje, ethical standards across the dressing room erode. Younger or less powerful players may feel pressure to comply, remain silent, or simply not ask questions. Silence itself becomes a form of participation. That is not an accusation. It is a reality acknowledged in almost every major sporting corruption scandal. What makes Boje's case especially controversial is how little transparency followed. Fans were told who was banned. They were not told why others were named but spared. No full explanation, no detailed public findings, just quiet continuation. And cricket moved on. Boje continued to play. He represented South Africa in major tournaments. He was part of a World Cup winning squad. Over time, his name faded from discussions about corruption entirely. But the King Commission remains part of the historical record, and records do not disappear just because they are uncomfortable. The lesson here is not that Nicky Boje was definitively corrupt. The lesson is that cricket systems often protect themselves by limiting how much truth reaches the public. Scandals are contained, damage is managed, narratives are simplified. One villain, a few bans, case closed. But corruption doesn't work that way. It spreads quietly. It survives in gray areas. It thrives when questions are left unanswered. Boje's story represents that gray zone, where suspicion exists without conviction, where implication exists without resolution. For fans, that may be frustrating. For the sport, it should be alarming. Because if cricket only punishes the most obvious offenders, it never truly cleans itself. The King Commission was a necessary reckoning, but it was also incomplete. It showed us how deep the problem ran and how carefully the sport chose to draw the line. Nicky Boje stands on that line, not condemned, not cleared in the court of public explanation, just left there. And that may be the most honest reflection of how corruption really works, not always loudly, not always conclusively, but persistently enough to leave a mark on history. This isn't about destroying reputations. It's about remembering what official inquiries actually revealed and what they didn't. Because when we forget the quieter names, we allow the same systems to survive. In cricket, more than any sport, has already paid the price for silence once.